Hello my fellow piratical explorers of the cosmic Soma. My name is Ben and today I feel inspired to shoot a video on one of my favourite topics, which is self-inquiry. So I'm going to be talking about how to combine self-inquiry with somatic inquiry for the purposes of spiritual awakening. So this video will be focused on spiritual awakening and for those people who have that as a goal or are interested. Now, by self-inquiry, what I'm referring to is that very traditional, classic spiritual technique in Advaita Vedanta. It's very ancient, but it was popularized by Ramana Maharshi, the famous Indian sage in the 20th century. So it's best known for that question, who am I? Nanyad. And somatic inquiry is those bottom-up techniques we use in our direct experience to go into the body and heal trauma, uncover core deficiency stories, undo emotional repression, and sort of heal from the inside out, so to speak. And I've been doing a lot of both, and I found it really useful to combine them. And I'll tell you what, some of the traps you can fall into if you don't have these two sides of this coin, and also how you can go about it, because it's actually a very simple, but it's a very difficult technique, and it's taken me years to really grasp how to do it and what the point is. So, what is self-inquiry? Just a quick definition. In Ramana Maharshi's terms, it was a technique, the goal of which is to dissolve or extinguish the experiencer. So we all have a sense of I, that sense of being a sort of a separate individual, long-lasting entity of some kind that we typically feel to be in the head, perhaps a little bit, maybe in the heart, but in the body somewhere that is the sort of the subject of everything that happens. And the purpose of spiritual awakening is to see through that illusion. And self-inquiry is sort of a central technique for deconstructing that illusion and dissolving that sense of being an experiencer. And what's unique about it, sort of the genius of Ramana Maharshi, was that rather than worrying so much about the objects of experience, self-inquiry is focused entirely on the subject. So it's a continuous investigation of the subject of experience. And that's sort of how the technique works. So continuously focusing on the subject, the felt sense of I. And I'll go into more detail about how to do that and how that works, because there's quite a lot of nuance there in a minute. But firstly, why would we want to combine these two? Well, I found in my own experience doing self-inquiry is it's very effective, but you run into some roadblocks. Often there's a lot of unconscious material in the body, a lot of shame and things like that really it's so tight and it's so obsessed with its own survival that it forms a kind of a roadblock to progress using that technique. And I found that things really started shifting once I started including somatic inquiry, once I started going within myself to dig up the repressed anger, getting tuned into my body so I wasn't dissociated anymore and sort of out of touch with my body and my feelings. Really working on that shame as well, which was driving a lot of my spiritual seeking as well. The really sort of urgency, that sort of deficient lack urgency, spiritual seeking kind of vibe. And once I started really getting to that, my self-inquiry, the Atma Vichara, took on a completely different flavour and colour and was much, much more effective. And so this is why I'm shooting this video. On the flip side is, if you're doing somatic inquiry without some of these other, a technique that sort of focuses on the subject, like self-inquiry, you can get very obsessed with the story of your own kind of healing. So if you're focusing just on, resolving your emotions and so on and so forth, you're not actually paying any attention to the I, the apparent experiencer, the apparent subject in all of that. And what happens is then the ego just reforms behind that whole effort. And although you'll probably feel better and happier in your body and you'll be less reactive and so on, but you're missing a key part of the puzzle. As what happens is that you will just be continuously, unless something is really triggering, you kind of won't pay attention to it, and you won't be prodding and poking at that ego in different areas of your life, which is sort of a requirement, because you need to see through it in all areas, right? In order to sort of break through. You can't just sort of focus on one little area and sort of ignore it everywhere else, right? It's at this juncture, it's probably worth saying, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, I'd like to add that I'm not enlightened. I haven't completed completed this, I still have a sense of ego and self, all that stuff. But I've been trying very hard at this stuff, particularly self-inquiry, and I've learned some stuff. You know, I've spoken to loads of people, read lots of books on this, and I've learned some things that I felt were worth sharing. So that's why I'm doing it, not from some position of having got somewhere really, but just I've been flapping about with this stuff for a while, and I've learned a few things I wanted to share. So I want to talk about now, there's a technique that's similar to self-inquiry that people use. They use it to combine it with somatic inquiry a lot, right? So people talk about resting in presence or being aware of awareness, you know, the sort of the Rupert Spira stuff. And that's all well and good, but I feel like people are missing a trick there, because the issue you have when you rest in presence or you're being aware of awareness is that it can be quite passive, and there's a big trap here, which is the following. I call it kind of the double ego problem, which is where you're kind of resting in presence and you can kind of see some of your stuff. You can see some thoughts and your feelings, and you're like, okay, that's not me. I'm resting in presence. I'm looking at it. But what happens is, as you put that first ego out in front of you, there's kind of like a second ego that comes in, and there's an ego observing the ego, right? And we're looking at one half of it, but there's this whole other formation here. And as we're just sitting there, you're kind of just sitting with another part of your ego. And so you're never, because it's quite a passive activity, you're just sitting there. There's no movement in there. There's no way of disrupting that, right? And this is a bit of a trap that I think you can fall into. And this is why, if you combine self-inquiry, which is a sort of continuous focusing on this subject, with somatic inquiry, you're covering kind of both ends of the spectrum, which, in my experience, is a much more complete practice that's much more effective. Now, how do you go about doing self-inquiry? I'll give you a few tips from my experience of how I kind of do it now. And I've gone through different stages of doing it in different ways, and you may find that in your own experience, that you start off doing it one way and you kind of do it another way. Because although the basic instruction is quite simple, pay attention to yourself, there's actually different ways of doing this. So one thing to say about it is it's something you want to be doing almost continuously throughout the day, to the best of your ability, right? That's kind of what gives it its potency. If you just do it for 5 minutes a day, not much is going to happen. It's that continuous focus on the subject that is what sort of brings the juice. That's what sort of tips the scales, if you will. Because if you're only doing it every now and again, it's by continuously concentrating, you begin to tip the scales in favor of no longer being so obsessed with your thoughts and feelings, and just continuously being able to abide more and more in that place that's looking, where you're looking from, you know, that sort of the root sense of I. So the way you want to do it is by continuously refocusing your attention onto your most basic sense of I. Now this I may change as you go through the process. At the beginning, often it's quite a mental sense of I, so it's like it's all up in the head. You know, you might have the actual thought I. Then as that tends to thin out or quiet down, it tends to move a little bit more into the body, and you have a kind of a heart or a gut sense of I. And then as you continue on, it tends to transform into more of a general sense of being. It's a little bit more transparent and general, but still a perception, you know, something you're noticing. And you know, these can occur simultaneously, but these are sort of the different ways that I can show up. And the point is to keep your attention on that the most basic sense you can find. In doing so, you're not actually finding your true self, because that can never be found as an object. What you're doing, you're getting sort of as close to it as possible. And you're almost using it as a mirror in which to see the reflection of your own being. So by that I mean, when you're sitting and you're aware of that most basic sense of your own existence, although that's an object you're perceiving, because you're perceiving it, you know that you exist. You know that you are aware. And that's the point where you want to be sitting, like right on that point where you know you're aware. Even though what you're aware of even the knowing, even that sense that you're aware of your own awareness, that's still an object you're perceiving, and so is not the awareness itself, which can never be grasped. You're trying to find the purest mirror you can, essentially, that reflects your own being. And so the purest mirror available is that the most basic sense of I you can find, essentially. An I that's less and less and less involved in the thoughts and feelings of the world. So it's that sense of I that you have. By focusing on it as purely as possible, you gradually sort of remove your attention from all the accoutrements, all the attachments to that I. So the story of my parents, my school, my history, and so on and so forth. Now, this is where this might sound at this point like it's quite similar to being aware of awareness, but here's the crux, right? This is the trick. This is what I found out. What you need to do is you need to continuously refocus your attention. Because what happens is the problem I set out a little earlier. When you focus on the sense of I, there's sort of, that instantly becomes an object. You can notice that's an object of your perception. And then whoop, another sense of I is created, which then is looking at that first sense of I. And so if you just stay there, you're just running into that problem again. Eventually, you're just kind of sitting there as the experiencer, just watching a thought or a feeling. And so you want to be continuously shifting. So you find the sense of I, then you want to look at what's looking at that. Then you want to look at what's looking at that. Then you want to look at what's looking at that. And that is the movement of self-inquiry. And that's where the difference is. And that's that active, confrontational... That's where you get your teeth into it, in that continual refocusing, not in the pure resting. A way I like to think of this, or a way that might help you to know where to focus your attention, is that when we have that sense of an experiencer, we have a sense of I and not I. So I have a sense now that there's kind of a me here that's maybe speaking and looking at the camera. And there's not I can see some trees and a window and a wardrobe and so on. And somewhere in between there's a kind of a skin, right? There's a sense, there's a skin that separates these two. And that's kind of like the boundary of that sense of I. And what I like to do is try and find the sense of that skin. And just sitting with that, just find that exact point where your being begins and is separated from the outside. And then as soon as you find that, you've then created another skin, do you see? Because then there's the I, then that skin becomes not I, and there's another I created behind it. So a new skin is formed. And you can kind of slowly, you want to just, find that skin here. Then the sense of ego, it moves a little, it just shifts subtly. And you just want to follow that shift and just stay with it to the best of your ability. They call this, in Advaita Vedanta, they call this hunting the I sometimes, right? And this is what makes it so powerful, is the fact that you're continually refocusing, so you're not just resting. And if you're doing that throughout the day, of continuously refocusing, that's wearing away at that apparent subject, the apparent experiencer. And then when you're doing your somatic inquiry, you're doing that deprogramming in the body and the mind that sort of gets those obstacles out of the way. So there are these roadblocks or obstacles that will distract your attention away from that investigation of self-inquiry. Because you're so, if you suddenly get triggered by something, you stop doing self-inquiry and you start paying attention to the trigger, right? Or you're just so worried, or there's some feeling you have that's so intense that you're completely drawn into it. And that's kind of that obstacle or roadblock that's so helpful to dissolve using slightly more specific techniques that focus on the objects. Then you can return during the day to focusing on the subject and sort of hacking away at that little thing. Let me talk about a few people who have given instruction on self-inquiry, because it may well be helpful to you. Because there are different ways of doing this. So I've described kind of one way, and I found that now to be the best because it's got this continual refocusing. But there are slightly different approaches as well. So I'm going to talk about three people. I'll start with Gary Weber. He was the first spiritual teacher that I really sort of connected with. And I'll put a link to his stuff down below. He's a big fan of the questions, and he doesn't really like who am I so much because he finds it gets a little entangled with personal stuff. So he's a big fan of where am I or who hears as ways of deconstructing or questioning the apparent experiencer. So as you might be going through your day, if you see thoughts arise about the apparent experiencer, you'd suddenly go, well, where am I? And you would look, physically look, and see if you can locate the I anywhere. Actually trying to find that sense that you have of your own existence, and trying to pin it down, and seeing again and again that you can't. And in that seeing, that kind of question of where am I, that kind of short circuits the mind. It's like you're going, oh, I need to go and do this, and I've got, what about that? I'm really worried about that. It's like, well, where's this I? Where am I? Have a look. I'm looking. Another one is who hears. This is a good one. So I like this because it's so far removed from all the thoughts and emotions. It's like you feel triggered by something. It's like, well, who hears right now? Who's hearing? There's a car going past over there. There's a sound that appears. Where's the subject of that sound? Who hears it? There's a moment when you ask the question, there's a moment when it short circuits the mind. And in that pause, you're resting in pure presence. And you can get better and better sort of as you do that more and more. That sort of gap, that pause, just tends to lengthen slowly, and you can spend more and more time resting in that space. And there's a lot more nuance to what he talks about. He involves he has specific practices as well for letting go of attachments, which is kind of like somatic inquiry. He actually describes some things that are very similar to the way some people do it. So he has these two sides of it as well: letting go of attachments, which is like paying attention to those objects, and doing the self-inquiry. He includes like chanting and stuff as well. He loves. It's cool stuff. Next up is Ramaji. So he has a book called Who Am I Meditation, and he advocates a kind of a two-step self-inquiry. And I've used this. This has been quite helpful as well. And you could almost sort of combine this with the first technique I described of the hunting the I, the continual refocusing. And the two-step process is, first of all, finding that sense of I that you have. So you might go, if some thoughts come up, you go like, who's having these thoughts? And what you want to do is you want to find that part of you that thinks it is having the thoughts. It's like, oh, it's me. I am. You can focus it to, ooh, me. I like to call it the sense of, ooh, me. Like, ooh, everyone has that. It's like, me. Find that. You might be a bit of a thought or a subtle feeling. And then that's the first part, is to locate that, get the I thought to come up. And the second part is you question it. Where does this I come from? And this again is a kind of a short-circuiting question. You bring up the I with the first question and you go, where does this come from? And there's no answer. There's no answer to that question. So in by bringing it up and then questioning it, he calls it, you knock it down. He calls it knocking the I thought down into the heart. So it's when you question it, it retreats. It goes retreats into its source. And then you can stay there, rest there. That's where you want to be. If the I thought is gone into its thought like a little badger back into its hole, then you can kind of rest in that place. But it will arise very quickly again. So that's why it's kind of a continual process to keep hacking away. So that's Ramaji. That's a very, very brief explanation. You can check out his book, Who Am I Meditation. He has another one that's quite good. Something about the spiritual heart. I can't remember. If you just type in Ramaji spiritual heart into Google, you'll find it. And the last one is Akhilesh Ayar of siftingtoTheTruth.com. Now he actually advocates something basically pretty similar to what I said at the beginning. He has a lot of good stuff to say about how to sort of hunt the I, and he also emphasizes that what you're kind of looking for ultimately is that by performing the self-inquiry, you're trying to figure out By what means do you know that you are? By what light do you know that you are? Because you know that you are, yet you aren't anything that you see, because that all comes and goes. Yet you know that you are. So there's something here that you aren't aware of, that doesn't come and go, by which you know that you are, yet you cannot find it or locate it. And so self-inquiry is the process of sort of determining what that is. He also advocates surrender, a surrender practice, where you don't try to do anything, you don't try not to do anything, you almost try to stay right there in the middle, and don't do anything else. You do absolutely nothing else. And he says these two ultimately converge, because if you're doing self-inquiry constantly, it turns into a kind of surrender, because the focus is so intense. I haven't been able to get to that level of intensity yet. I think it'd be pretty difficult, just because the fear is too strong. The fear of fully surrendering, of just constantly inquiring and letting go of my life is too intense. But that's kind of the direction of travel you want to be going in, where that inquiry, that surrender is so intense that that all the other stuff kind of falls to the wayside. But easier said than done. So that's some cool work to check out. So if you have a look at those three people, that will give you some more information as well. And there's Ramana himself. There's a really good book called Be As You Are by David Godman, which covers his work pretty in depth, and he has good essays on his website as well. And the Ramana approach, he really just focuses on continuously coming back to the subject, just not paying attention to anything else, just coming back to the subject, which of course, like I said, you can't actually ever get to the ultimate subject. The closest you can get is that pure mirror of the pure feeling of being. That's kind of the closest you can get, and you just want to sit there right on that point, but continuously refocusing to make sure that you are actually sitting there, not just sitting with ego looking at something else. There we are. Is there anything else that I want to say here? Let me have a think. Just that I found these approaches to be really powerful if you combine them. Now in my life, it's a completely different experience of life, with a much more transparent body, a much more transparent mind. But when you do self-inquiry, it's like all these little bits of thoughts that you wouldn't bother doing somatic inquiry with tend to fall away. So you end up with a much sort of just much quieter mind overall, which makes all aspects of this work much easier, and it's just more enjoyable as well. You're much more present, much more in tune with life, and as that skin I was talking about starts to thin out, it just life becomes less of a me, not me, and that slowly transforms into more of just a field of life. It's more just a field of life happening. And that sense of me, not me, just slowly thins out more and more and more. And it's weird at certain points, it's like the world starts to become your body, almost like the trees and the wind. It's just sort of as much your body as the sensations of my hands and the thoughts and what have you. So let me know how you get on, if this was helpful, and good luck. Peace out. Bye.